Hi, my name is Sheavaun. I'm going to be reading to you today my story called He Dances With Me. And just a forewarning, if you're one of those people that thinks that everything that should be put out should be really polished and perfect, you're going to be really disappointed. My whole purpose here is just to share because I think we all need to share. We've all had those moments of disbelief where we think this is the kind of stuff that happens to other people. The feeling doesn't exactly foster anything warm and cozy or a sense of value. No, it's all about survival. And it's comforting and encouraging to know that we're not the only ones in the midst of it. I lived for years in survival mode. Growing up in a nice middle-class home as a classic daddy's girl, I didn't have to worry about much. So when I married and began to have children of my own, the concept of struggling was foreign to me. When I first learned of my dad's prostate cancer while I was in my mid-20s, I distinctly remember thinking that this was exactly the kind of thing I'd heard stories about, and was shocked that it was occurring within my personal circle. I had no idea that things could get worse. In relaying part of my story, my hope is that you will be able to see some of yourself in it. Not because I think I'm a great storyteller, but because I've learned that there's value in sharing our stories, since we tend to see ourselves in each other. More than that, I hope that you will recognize my hero and be encouraged by what I've learned about him, as well as myself along the way. And maybe, just maybe, you will find the courage to look at your own life as a story and be willing to share it with someone else. There's something very wrong about taking the hospital elevator down to the basement in order to say goodbye to your son. The ever-present antiseptic smell is awful enough. But when you add in the concrete walls and the cold floors of a barren underground space with the metal chairs scraping the hard surface with every little movement, the stone in the pit of the belly just gets heavier and heavier. How do I cope with the memories of holding his stiff, cold body as I rock him in the ugly chair, crying helpless tears, whispering, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't here." All I know is I didn't want to let him go. At all. This couldn't really be happening. What happened? It went something like this. I was 25 years old, pregnant with our second child, and very uncomfortable. The sleepless nights and the fact that I couldn't walk any farther than half a block or stand upright long enough to wash the dishes wasn't enough to make me run to my doctor and whine. I had tried to tell her in my last appointment that things weren't really feeling right, but she dismissed my concerns with a flick of her hand, stating that it was probably going to be a boy this time around. So who was I to question? But I was experiencing more trouble physically as the weeks passed. I couldn't sleep because I had a deep, throbbing pain in my lower back. I'd stand in the shower or run myself a hot bath for relief in the middle of the night with no luck. I was unable to stand for any length of time for the pain and found myself getting frustrated with mandolin easily. Rather than help or understanding from my spouse, I felt that he thought I was making a big deal out of something I'd already done once before. After landing us a contract with a management company, his singer-songwriter-musician dreams were coming true with me as his trusty sidekick. And all I could think about during our photo shoot was how heavy I felt, likening myself to the white tubby Michelin tire man. My feet even sloshed when I walked. By the time I was 26 weeks along, my mother-in-law persuaded me to see her physician since I wasn't thrilled about going back to Debbie Downer MD. So I sat in the new doc's office and began to blubber as soon as he started to ask questions. I felt silly, but was so beside myself with pain and lack of sleep that I completely unraveled before his eyes. With my nose chock full of snot, hiccuping sporadically, I tried to describe what I'd been dealing with. But judging by the look on his face, he was unsure of how to deal with emotional pregnant women, nor did he have a hot clue what was wrong with me. Pushing his glasses up on his nose, he swiveled his chair closer to mine, wielding the blood pressure cuff, and proceeded to take my vitals. Lo and behold, my new physician's demeanor changed dramatically after getting my blood pressure and began to talk to me about popping into the lab for some blood tests that he'd put a rush on and to expect a call from him later that afternoon. And oh, by the way, I should pack for the hospital and make arrangements for my toddler. 2 hours after leaving the lab, I picked up the phone and heard the doctor's voice confirm that my blood work validated his hunch, mentioning something about my liver and platelets not being right. He said he made arrangements for me at Foothills Hospital and they were expecting me that afternoon. Slightly in shock, I hung up and slowly turned to my husband to relay the message. The weight of my current reality was sinking in. But at least our almost 2-year-old would be looked after by my mother-in-law and my husband. It seemed like only a couple of weeks ago that my biggest worry was how I was going to love another child when I loved the one we had so much already. Was it possible to love more than one so deeply? Or was she going to be robbed of what she'd been accustomed to receiving from me? Somehow these questions began to slip from the front row seats as I found myself changing into a hospital gown after saying goodbye to my cherub-faced toddler and her dad. I've heard a doctor say recently that HELP syndrome is a name for a condition that they don't really know much about. But at the time, I was told I had a very elevated form of toxemia which put my and my baby's life at risk. Extreme toxicity. My baby was trying to grow and develop in a toxic waste dump. No wonder I couldn't stand or lie down very long. My liver was freaking out and so were my kidneys. I was toxic. There was something wrong with me. After a couple of weeks of enduring early morning blood tests, frequent doctor visits, and missing my nearly 2-year-old daughter intensely, I engaged in light banter with my favorite nurse while she moved the wand over my jellified belly to get a good look at my baby. There was a bit of a flurry around me that morning because my lab work had come back a little differently. The attending doctor poked his head in to check on me, and after a brief chat with my nurse, turned to go. Just then, I noticed her demeanor change after watching the screen, and she got up to chase him. I heard some intense whispering in the hall, and all of a sudden, my room became a beehive of activity. I remember someone telling me that they needed to perform an emergency C-section to save my life. And oh, did I know where my husband was? They needed to let him know what was happening. In the operating room, a sheet was put in front of me so I couldn't see what they were doing. But the anesthesiologist kept asking me questions like what my name was, how many kids I had, until I heard another male voice on the other side of the sheet ask if I could feel that. I noticed the strange, dull pressure in my abdomen like someone was rooting around in there, and I awoke later to find out that my son had been whisked away to the neonatal intensive care unit. No wrapped little bundle to put against my chest and kiss his precious head. No attempt to breastfeed, no mother-son bonding. My baby was put in an incubator because he was only 28 weeks old instead of the typical 40, and was underdeveloped for that age because of how sick I had been, his lungs being the greatest concern, of course. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, I overheard a nurse remarking that she'd never witnessed so much fluid spill out during a C-section before. Great. There was something wrong with me. The next day, I begged the nurse on duty to please take me to see my son, since they couldn't bring him to me. So she wheeled my bed to his unit directly in front of his incubator. I was stunned. He looked like a miniature version of the pictures I'd seen of emaciated, starving people in third world countries. He was the size of my hand, weighing less than 2 pounds, and I cried as I gazed on his tiny form. I wasn't allowed to touch him yet because he was too fragile. What had happened? Over the next few months, I found myself driving back and forth to the children's hospital to visit our son, hoping for some sort of sign that he knew who I was, his mommy. To no avail. I was floundering as I tried to balance my love and devotion for my daughter at home with my desperate hope for a bond with my son. I received a note from another mom in our ward who was most likely trying to encourage me, explaining that our son showed many of the same signs her child did at that age, and he had cerebral palsy. I didn't know what to make of the note, considering that our doctor wasn't willing to give any sort of definitive answers of that sort. Graduating from the incubator to an oxygen tube in his nose, feeding through another tube that initially traveled through his mouth to his tummy, I was a little overwhelmed. Twice he had to be intubated, life support, due to infection, and the subsequent scar tissue on his lungs was worrisome. In his entire 8 months of life, I got to bring him home one night, dutifully administering his meds, keeping the oxygen tube close by, but practically flew back to the hospital the next day due to the bluish-gray color of his skin and difficulty breathing. Every once in a while, I would find myself thinking, this is the sort of thing that happens to other people, and realized it was the same way I felt when my dad told me he had cancer 3 years earlier. After pulling through his second bout of infection and intubation, and despite our preparations to say goodbye to him, Joseph surprised us by appearing to get stronger, and it wasn't long before we were told that we should be able to bring him home within a month's time. My husband and I were still pursuing a music career, and we were given an opportunity to open for a well-known singer on tour for 2 weeks, so we chose to go, lining up close friends and family to visit our baby every day, with the expectation of bringing him home shortly after we returned. On the morning of our departure, Kevin, Mandolin, and I quietly said goodbye to baby Joseph, fully trusting we'd see him again in a couple of weeks. I knew deep down that we shouldn't be going, but I didn't speak up for fear of causing any more waves in my already tumultuous world. We didn't have cell phones, but I called the hospital every day to check on Joseph. As we made our way home after finishing the tour, we stopped by my brother's farm, and there received a phone call from my mom, whose house we just left a few hours earlier. She said Joseph's doctor was trying to reach us and that it was very important. I immediately called, and I was shocked to find her in tears as she told me that we needed to get home as fast as we could because little Joey Tomato had taken a bad turn, and it appeared that this was his heart that was giving out this time. We didn't have much time, yet we were at least 12 hours away in our rust bucket of a car, too poor to buy a plane ticket. Every time we stopped for gas, I called his nurses to see how he was doing, and every time they replied that he was still breathing, but I needed to hurry. We had made it just over halfway when the car started to make some unusual noises, and we had to pull over to investigate. I ran for a payphone and was stunned as I heard the now familiar voice soften with pity as she relayed the news that my son had passed away just 10 minutes before. And the car wouldn't start. The drive home the next day was a blur, but I'll never forget sitting in the basement of the hospital holding my cold son, rocking him back and forth, telling him how sorry I was for not being there, that my body had failed him, and for all he had to endure as he struggled for life. The guilt was nearly unbearable for so many reasons. And the kicker was that I had just found out the week before via an over-the-counter pregnancy test that I was expecting again. Family and friends came from all over to support us in our grief, but all I could process was my guilt. Did I have the right to mourn someone I didn't really know, who I had been unable to establish a connection with? My loss wasn't nearly as horrible as a parent who had lost an older child, was it? And how dare we even entertain the idea of having another child in his stead? It was not planned, but the fact remained that I was expecting again, and it felt strange to have to switch gears. How did one go about this? After the funeral, everyone filed past my baby's open casket to say their last goodbyes, and the layer of protection I had managed to build around my flailing heart began to crumble as wonderful people bent over his dear form to whisper sweet farewells. The very act of making these poor souls gaze upon his lifeless body on their way out was not my idea at all, but I'll always remember the kindness exhibited by so many. When we rose from our seats, my dad took one look at me and folded me into his embrace, letting me sob on his shoulder in pain and disbelief. As we made our way to the gravesite, I found myself bathed in incredulity as my mom complained about the heat in the car. Who cares about the temperature? I was a failure as a person, as a mother. We were on our way to watch my son be buried in the dirt. Once we had gathered around the little plot, I realized I was unable to stay after all the proper things had been done. I keenly felt the disappointment of all those who had assembled to support and comfort us, but I couldn't face them. I couldn't face myself. After the funeral, we returned to the home of a close friend where our family from out of town was staying. Excuse me. and my husband and I decided to share the news of our pregnancy in an effort to provide a measure of hope. The smiles The smiles and surprise were warm, and our family rallied to congratulate and help us look forward toward the future. But my heart was broken. I was a high-risk pregnancy now, so was monitored closely over the preceding months. Just as I finished my first trimester, I found myself bleeding profusely in the front seat of the car while waiting for my husband to do an errand. Later, in the hospital, we learned I had experienced a threatened miscarriage. Threatened, but I did not miscarry. Again with the close monitoring. Our second daughter was born at 6 o'clock on a cold wintry morning 6 months later. Of all the things I did not expect, my husband leaned closer to my ear and asked me if I thought there might be something wrong with her. Exhausted, I turned to one of the attending nurses and repeated the question. Her answer was to ask me if I thought there was. What a circus. But the next day, after multiple testing, it was confirmed that Hannah indeed had Down syndrome. Surprise! An important part of becoming a parent to a special needs child is to allow yourself time to grieve what you thought you'd lost, like a normal life. But I didn't. Rather, I steeled myself from any emotion other than fierce protection and love, most likely because I felt so much guilt regarding her brother. That I needed to do whatever, that I felt that I needed to do whatever I could to help her live a full life, thus ignoring my own emotions. I figured that whatever was wrong with her was all my fault, since it was my body she was formed in. There was something wrong with me. It didn't take long for my parents to drive out to meet our new addition, and it was then that my dad started to feel poorly again. Upon returning home, they discovered that his cancer had returned, and within 6 months, he was paralyzed from the waist down. A year later, I watched him pass away as I stood next to his bed. It was surreal. My dad couldn't really be gone. 4 months after my dad's passing, my husband claimed that he was experiencing strange symptoms and informed me that his doctor had diagnosed him with cancer. I was devastated and found myself walking around in a fog, very fearful. During this time, we had been traveling through the States with Hannah, Mandolin, and our dog Barney, singing in churches, living in motels, or camping on the beaches of California. Fast forward a few more months, and upon learning Kevin was cancer-free, I became pregnant once again. Yes, I do know how it works. By the time I was 7 months along, I was completely burned out, and I wanted to go home. We had purchased a broken-down little farmhouse in small-town Saskatchewan when I was pregnant with Hannah, but had left to travel before we ever moved in and fixed it up. So that's where we headed. Since playing for our bread and butter was all my husband felt qualified to do to survive, he would go on tour by himself for weeks at a time, leaving me at home with our 3 girls to raise. Our newest daughter, Ruby, began to regale us with all the wonders of colic. Hannah had finally learned to walk at the grand old age of 3, having absolutely no interest in following direction or listening to reason, and our eldest daughter, Mandolin, was about to begin 1st grade in a new town, a new school, living in our new-to-us old farmhouse. I was forced into learning how to manage as a single parent. The rumblings of volcanic activity within me were heard when I'd yell or speak sharply to Mando, and I could see her beautiful little spirit wither each time. What was happening to me? I felt so much darkness, so much heaviness. All I knew how to do was put out the fires, when what I really wanted was to prevent the eruptions in the first place. I was scared of all the unknowns, of all that could go wrong, and my go-to emotion was anger. It was like I had a pressure cooker inside, and no matter how many times I apologized, I'd just end up going there again. Frustrated by my apparent inability to be the mom I had dreamed of being as a young woman, I resigned myself to surviving each day as it came. I was existing on the dregs of yesterday's coffee and whatever sugary treat I had baked for the kids. Juggling 3 children along with the denial of my pent-up anger, my feelings of never quite doing it all good enough and my fear of the unknown was wreaking havoc on me. I was exhausted. I knew I wasn't supposed to complain. Rolling out of bed in the morning was an act of sheer will. I wasn't supposed to rock the boat. My marriage was not ideal, but I said vows, and I didn't believe in quitting, so tough luck. My middle daughter had special needs that I was continually struggling to understand, but I had suffered the loss of her older brother, so I'd suck this up too. The result was a slow death of who I was, because I could not reconcile the pain I endured. Building walls around it to try to protect myself from further damage. Desperately afraid of the next wallop that I could not predict or control. Maybe it would be an accident involving either my oldest or my youngest daughter. Maybe a freak natural disaster like a tornado would flatten our house and we'd be left homeless. Maybe there'd be a fire and I'd survive but barely. Or an intruder, or a stalker, or a drunk driver, or a wildcat prowling too close to our home. Fear is debilitating. It sucks the very life out of you, leaving no room for anything else. And it got free reign in my little world because I couldn't trust that God was good to me. You know, beyond sending Jesus to die and giving me a ticket to eternity if I wanted it. As a result, anger was the go-to emotion for years, fueled by my fear of everything. What a way to live. I was completely at a loss as to how to stop the continual anger until I was able to reconcile. The fear was at the root of it all. Fear was the reason I was dying a slow, uncomfortable death. After making a few friends in our little town, I launched myself into planning a yearly women's Christmas event that gave me a sense of purpose. You'd never catch me dead going to one of those on my own, but I planned one. I wanted to provide something that was out of the ordinary, so we brought in guest presenters and musicians, providing a delicious meal, dessert. In retrospect, I can see that it was probably more for me than for many of the women who attended. And I also adored our huge yard, and I threw myself into the task of planting flowers and vegetables, had no idea what I was doing. And I'd often sit in our bay window with its cracked panes and soak in the soothing effects of what I had accomplished outdoors. But I noticed that I was having difficulty keeping weight off. Trouble getting out of bed in the mornings, and I was often sullen and unhappy. I began to see a doctor who put me on medications to try pull me out of this apparent depression, but I couldn't seem to shake it. As a young wife, the idea that my husband considered me beautiful at all was bittersweet, because I also thought that it was all I had to offer him. I'd felt like an ugly duckling growing up, so naturally I assumed that God was going to take that away from me to make me beautiful on the inside instead. Gosh, because Kevin's affections were ill-won. I had an ever-present fear of some type of accident or fire that would leave me disfigured, and then my husband wouldn't want me anymore at all. My lack of trust in God regarding these areas of my life had nothing to do with whether or not I thought he could handle any of it. It wasn't a matter of whether or not he was big enough or strong enough. I just didn't think his version of what was best for me and my version were in the same ballpark. I needed to get through each day, and I figured he just needed to take care of the world. I was also pretty sure that since there always seemed to be something I was doing wrong, I was supposed to learn my lessons the hard way, just so I wouldn't forget. That being said, I was constantly in fear of being taught a lesson from God. Later, after the death of our son, birth of our daughter with special needs, and subsequent birth of our youngest daughter who was normal, I lived in fear that it was only a matter of time before something would happen to Ruby, because it was too good to be true. Good things were not holy things. They were magnets for trouble. I was alone, though surrounded by children, a married but very single mom. Frightened of potential natural disasters, intruders, sickness, or accidents, I was constantly stressed out, always angry. I was disappointed in my marriage and how our lives were run, yet refrained from broaching the subject with my husband for fear of rocking the boat even further. The idea of trusting God was out of the question because I was sure he would just make it worse, so it was best to keep him at arm's length. Funny thing though, I also had a secret longing somewhere down deep to have a connection with God that I'd witnessed a choice few seem to have. I didn't know how to describe or express it, but the longing was there. There had to be more. I was missing something. The disintegration of my marriage 2 years after I went nuclear on my husband and spewed all the things I was dissatisfied and angry about with him was the final straw that broke my camel's back. I really was alone now. I really was helpless. I really didn't have any hope. I really didn't have anything left to fight with. The crunch of bones as I hit bottom was sickening, yet a relief in a twisted way. I gave up. I didn't ask for God's help. My mom did. As she listened to me wail over the phone, telling her my marriage was over, she began to pray for me, and I let her. I didn't care. Curling up on the bottom of my dry bathtub, fully clothed, I heaved great racking sobs of despair, simply grateful that someone was listening to me. It was almost startling to realize that as I listened to my mother ask God to give me peace and comfort, I began to feel something foreign course through me. My crying ceased, yet I knew I wasn't done. I didn't want to be done. But I felt something smooth out my insides, like a lake that had been crashing against the shore, suddenly calm as glass. This was surreal. I knew it was God. Somehow my mom had gotten through to him. Weird. Maybe I should explain how I perceived God. I'd heard about him at a children's Bible study when I was 12, and after deciding I liked what I'd heard after a few weeks, I sat on my bed in my dark bedroom one night and asked him to live in my heart. I wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but since it's what they said to do, I ran with it. My parents and brother had made decisions to believe in God on their own, either before or after I did, for their own different circumstances. So my high school years were spent in church and youth groups and a couple of missions trips overseas with the ever-growing notion that I'd better make a habit of keeping God from being mad at me. He was bigger and better than I was, so I just had to make sure I was always keeping my nose clean, so to speak. What an endeavor. Let's just say I'm somewhat feisty with a keen sense of adventure. Okay, so I learned to have a quick temper and potty mouth somewhere along the way. Therefore, I found myself saying sorry in my prayers rather frequently. I was constantly aware of falling short of God's honor roll, if he had one. The other thing I had convinced myself of was that it was God's business to forgive and to love me. So I was under the impression that I was just one of the many stupid sheep in the shepherd's flock that had to be looked out for. I wasn't necessarily special, but at least I was in the club. So when my husband and I used to travel the country singing together, I felt an ache. Or was it a sinking feeling? No, it was an ache. A longing that suspected it would never be fulfilled, as I felt life carry on as though everything was all right. Lights passed by in a blur, the blobs that must be houses whispering their taunts as our van carried me through neighborhoods that I would never be part of. Dining rooms that I'd never eat in with my family, nor watch television in the den together, or rest my head on my own pillow in my own bed with my own doors locked. Resigned, I felt like I didn't belong anywhere I longed to be. Life had not turned out the way I had expected it to. After flying by the seat of my pants without a definite plan for years, I had hoped that all my winging it would somehow turn out all right. Not that I had great expectations. I thought they were normal ones. Have a husband I love with a good job, a couple kids or more, pets, a nice comfortable house, nothing extravagant. I'd always wanted to travel, and I have that sense of adventure, but this was getting old. Is this all that there was going to be? I hope not. 3 years of driving all over the United States to sing in churches was a long time for me. Hotel rooms held no allure. I was an expert at asking directions. I knew how to book dates, communicate well over the phone, and I put people at ease. I could smile till my cheeks hurt and draw people into worship from the stage, but I wasn't happy. Life wasn't what I expected. My 30th birthday was a major letdown. I could remember my mom telling me that she'd love turning 30, so I looked forward to it rather than feeling the dread many 29-year-olds feel about it. Sitting in an Olive Garden restaurant in California that day with my husband and our friend while I was 6 months pregnant with our fourth child was just anticlimactic for me. There was so much that I had tamped down into the deep recesses of my heart that I was afraid to let loose, and the anticipation of good things ahead did not mix well with what I had so far experienced. I was exhausted from pushing away all the guilt and anger and pain I did not want to release. Joy was just a word. Peace was an illusion. Hard work, suffering, and keeping my head above water were my crutches. Fast forward to a 30-something with a grade schooler, a dead baby, a child with special needs. I had no idea how to parent, and a toddler, and I began to further disconnect from reality. It was just too painful, and I connected that pain to the belief that there was something wrong with me, so this imbalance was my fault. Like many people, the lies I heard in my head were the same ones I heard as a kid, just with a different spin. The same internal fingers pointing to the same vulnerable areas of my heart and esteem, chanting the same mantra over and over again. There must be something wrong with you. When I was young, I can remember those words clearly sashaying back and forth across my consciousness whenever something happened I couldn't explain, and it continued into my adulthood. I was too bossy. I wasn't smart enough. I wasn't pretty. I was too loud. I had unrealistic expectations. To say that I finally came to the end of myself halfway through my 30s when my husband told me he was leaving me and wanted a divorce would be an understatement. I was done trying to hold my head up. Done trying to go with whatever it was life was going to throw at me, doing my best to make it work. Over the ensuing weeks and months of our separation, I began to read my Bible to try and figure out some of this God stuff out for myself. I couldn't read parts of the Psalms where someone was venting their anguish because all that did was cause my own wounds to start seeping again. But I found solace in other Psalms where God was being thanked for coming to someone's rescue or being praised because he was just so great. I wanted that. I began to ask God questions, and wonder of wonders, he began to talk to me. It took a while for me to accept that it was really him and not just my imagination, because I know there's lots of studies out there about that. But I eventually acquiesced and began to notice small changes begin to take place in my cold heart. In particular, I remember one night when I was praying and feeling a little guilty for not wanting to read any of the New Testament. With a bit of sass, I told God that I didn't want to read the New Testament books, especially the Gospels, because I thought Jesus was mean and crabby. I kind of cringed once I admitted it, but what happened next was a complete surprise. All of a sudden, I had a mental picture of a man sitting on the sofa across from me, comfortable, relaxed, and not scary at all. Then I had the thoughts flit through my mind asking, if he was so mean, why did so many people follow him everywhere? Why did the down and outers spend so much time with him, seek him out? And somehow I knew that in that moment, God had gently helped me disengage the false beliefs I held about his son through the frame of my imagination. I saw a Christian counselor to help me sort through this new season I was going through, and I'll never forget his comment to me one day. I don't think you realize how much God gets a kick out of you. He was right. I didn't. But oh, how I wanted to. This was all so new to me, but I was bent on figuring it out as best as I could. I was sitting in a relatively comfortable chair across from this kind older gentleman who was listening to me berate myself for the kind of person I was. I mean, who drives their husband away? What kind of Christian is angry all the time, frustrated that what she reads about in the Bible is basically a fairy tale for her because she's never experienced any fruit, anything positive? Rather, I was stuck, stressed, and basically ready to give up. My husband had already walked out, so why not? Why try? After letting me expound for a relatively polite amount of time, this really nice man starts to tell me a story. Gosh, I wish I could remember his name. Anyway, apparently he used to be a pastor before he retired and went into counseling. He recounted a time when he was leading a small group study on the fruit of the Spirit and used Psalm 1 as the passage. His focus at the time was on the fruit and how important it was, when he felt God arrest him right there where he was at and shift his focus from the fruit to the trees. Oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand around with sinners, or join in with scoffers. But they delight in doing everything the Lord wants. Day and night they think about his law. They are like trees planted along the riverbank, bearing fruit each season without fail. Their leaves never wither, and in all they do they prosper. Psalm 1, 1-3. Verse 3 makes it clear that the only way that these trees bear fruit is because they're planted along a riverbank. Not only do they bear fruit, but they do it each season without fail. They don't dry up and wither, but instead they prosper. Here's what I learned that day from the really nice man. There was way more to my story than how I had screwed up. In order to produce anything remotely positive like the spiritual fruit written about in Galatians 5:22, I need to have a very real connection to this God who says he loves me. Even Paul emphasizes that it's the Holy Spirit who produces love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It's not by my striving that I'll achieve these things on my own. I tried, and I failed. When this truth started to trickle into my awareness receptors, I decided that I wanted more. I was thirsty. Parched, actually. What has happened in the time since is that I've been reminded that Jesus wraps up the law spoken of in Psalm 1 with these two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew 22:37-40. In hindsight, I see now that I grew up learning about God, but didn't know I could get to know him intimately like a dear friend. That discovery changed a lot for me, as did the realization that not only did he love me like I thought he had to, but he really likes me for me. After fielding so many tragedies in a short amount of time, I felt like a victim. I didn't have the tools to help me work through each of them and learn how to go forward. Instead, I felt like a blade of grass that got whipped around in whatever direction the wind was blowing, resenting the lack of control I felt, and I blamed myself and my husband for the state I was in. And I would be remiss to skip the part about realizing I was codependent, and that part of it did have to do with my husband and how he dealt with his own issues. Learning to differentiate between each other's stuff and my compulsion to manipulate, albeit on the sly, and learning to establish personal boundaries has been a huge key to my ability to attain happiness again. I've had to learn to forgive and to let go. Two of the very hardest things for a woman to do in my mind. I've traveled my road determined to find out if there was more out there than what I'd seen. I've come to find that God really is a good God, and he's given me a lot more control than I knew I had. I've learned that as a woman, I'm extremely valuable, powerful, and needed. I have learned that God fills all the empty, achy cracks in my life that I wished my husband could fill. I can live a full life. It's not perfect, and I have my moments just like everyone else where I have to catch my breath and force myself to remember whose I am and who he is. I have learned to practice being content, yet pressing on toward the goal of being all he created me to be. My initial reaction during a stressful situation is to be anxious. Yet I'm very aware of the verse in Philippians 4:6-8. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your heart and your minds in Christ Jesus. I just didn't know how to let go, no matter how many times I quoted the verse to myself. I thought it was all up to me. One of the hardest things I've found to do is to rest. Rest meaning to trust implicitly that the God in whom I put my trust knows everything that is happening to me at any given time, and that He has provided all that I need and more. Because when I'm in the middle of a mess or uncertain situation, the last thing I feel like doing is trusting what I can't see. It's crazy right now, so how can I trust that everything is going to be okay? Rest is a deliberate inner decision to trust and have complete confidence in the God who loves me. To take His promises personally, to quiet myself before Him, remind myself of His goodness, and allow His still, small voice to speak to my heart. That is rest. It takes work to rest. The last 10 years of my marriage were extremely unstable in that I never knew where I stood in our relationship. Now I take that back. I knew that I no longer stood on a pedestal as far as my husband was concerned. Not that the pedestal was ideal, because I felt like more of a shiny trophy than loved, despite my many quirks and faults, but at least there was some value. The second that I communicated my unhappiness to my husband about my disenchantment with where we were in life, as well as his role in it all, I came crashing down from my perch, never to return. Let me make it abundantly clear that the manner in which I spoke to him was extremely disrespectful. It was hurtful, and it was downright mean. The valve blew off the pressure cooker that had been boiling for way too long, and what came flying out was like a volcanic eruption. He was devastated. The problem with it all was that the majority of what I told him was the truth. I was disappointed, angry, fed up, but it didn't mean I wanted to quit. It took a full 2 years of living on eggshells after I threw all my nastiness at him, of being held at arm's length, withering under his cold silences, and me numbly taking each day as it came, hoping for a change, until he came to me and said he thought he should move out because it wasn't working out between us. I felt like he had heaved a bucket of ice water on me, and I felt so many emotions race through me in that instant. I asked him not to do it, but he was firm. So I thought I'd call his bluff, and I packed a few of his bags with his clothes and set them by the door, thinking that he'd back down and talk to me instead. No dice. He just shook his head, grabbed his bags, and moved into the little house we rented next door for his musicians that came to stay. What was worse, it was where we were letting my good friend stay at the time. She was a singer-songwriter, and I had practically begged my husband to work with her, which he did, and that resulted in them doing some shows and traveling together. I trusted my husband implicitly then, yet when the two of them returned from their trip, she and her husband split up for reasons of their own, and it was shortly after that my husband made his announcement to me. My friend and my husband told me repeatedly that there was nothing going on between them, yet I saw how he acted around her. She made him feel value when all he felt from me was disapproval. He then came to me within a month and said he planned to move to a little town somewhere with her and start over. How does one even begin to describe a broken heart? It goes beyond the pain I felt when I lost my son, or the pain of losing my dad way too early. The devastation is utterly complete, leaving nothing intact, all bruised and cut, barely pulsing with life around the gaping hole in the middle. I found myself releasing years of stored up tears, desperately trying to assuage the pain, never mind the guilt that oozed from every pore. In the back of my mind, I knew that all the things that bothered me about our marriage were still not dealt with, but at this point, all that mattered was that I had been discarded by the one I had pledged my life to. I was loyal. I did everything expected of me, and this is what I got? No bother to work out our differences? Even if he was angry and hurt, wasn't our marriage worth a fight? And he was with my friend. Talk about betrayal. The looks, the smiles, the light touches, the respect. It all tore my heart to pieces. They didn't move away together, but instead she moved to a nearby city, and he made nightly visits to my door, taking advantage of my desperation by sharing my bed without the intimacy we once knew. It didn't take him long to move to a small town 15 minutes away from ours. I can remember when he would come over to see our girls, how I would just erupt with emotion, screaming at him, calling him and my ex-friend names, then dissolving in a puddle of despair when he left. All he would do was shake his head and laugh at me. He told me there was no amount of counseling that could ever help us. The only thing that could bring me any measure of peace was worship music. The radio was a definite no, as well as was TV, because hearing about anyone else's pain was simply unbearable. I could put worship CDs on for Hannah and find myself calmed by them. Yet whenever Kevin came to the house, he would refute the lyrics to one song in particular, All Things Are Possible, and say, "You know that's not true, right?" I questioned my standing with God, sure that I was on the blacklist for so many reasons. Yet listening to songs of praise airlifted me out of my despair in ways I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't long before my mom and my brother's wife became my primary sources of strength and encouragement. They began to talk to me about fighting for my husband with prayer and with love. Completely riddled with guilt and not knowing what else to do, I jumped on that bandwagon, determined to do my part in repairing our broken marriage. If there was any shred of hope, I would take it and make it mine. So I learned the verse in Micah that talks about how God hates divorce because it was like a coat that was torn in two. I learned about the beauty that God intended for marriage between two people to have. I learned about the power of speaking God's words over my husband, even in his absence. I learned to pray for him from Stormy Martín's book, The Power of a Praying Wife. I learned to forgive him for leaving me and for turning his affections to my friend instead of working things out with me. And to forgive her as well. Not because I was letting them off the hook, but because I understood that the hatred and bitterness was eating me up on the inside, and I didn't need to keep giving them that power. I also learned to trust God to provide for me financially. Since moving to our little town, I had not worked outside the home except for teaching play school to Ruby and her peers. But that was no longer an option since my estranged husband wasn't bringing in any money. So I got a job delivering newspapers in the morning as well as cleaning our local post office. The TV was cut off, so my girls and I learned to play card games together, and we would dance in the kitchen to music, doing our best to keep our heads above water. I'm glad that Mandolin was blessed with a friend her age to help her carry her burden, and give her a place to go that was safe where she could briefly get away from the pain at home. Halfway through the year, I was asked by the mom of one of my girlfriends if I could paint. She ran her own residential painting business and was looking for help. What a gift it was to work with her. Not only did she teach me new skills like hanging drywall, mudding, repairing, as well as painting, she also became a source of strength, wisdom, and comfort. She chaired the women's group at my church that planned the annual Christmas dinner for the community and convinced me to help her that year as well. I was beginning to feel my feet underneath me again. Then out of the blue, after being apart for a full year, Kevin asked me if he could move in back in so we could try to work things out for the kids' sake. I was sure that this was God's doing. He was answering my prayers, working behind the scenes, and I didn't even know it. I conceded, and we became a family again to the random onlooker, and I returned to walking on eggshells again. I was young, idealistic, adventurous, completely unrealistic, and sure that the world owed me something when I first met my future husband. In hindsight, my self-esteem was not formed very confidently at the time we began to date. Are you surprised? I was very self-conscious, constantly concerned about what others thought of me, and I didn't have my own aspirations, dreams, goals, or opinions because I was afraid of failure. So upon dating, then marrying a strong personality with plenty of drive, goals, dreams, and opinions of his own, I became a human barnacle and attached myself to all things Kevin to make up for my own deficit, therefore not taking the time or effort to understand or develop myself. Right off the bat, I worked to support us while my new husband began to pursue his dream of writing and producing music. Within a year, I quit my job and gave up our first house to join him on the road as we toured Western Canada and parts of the northern United States singing together. I was thrilled to be part of the adventure, but quickly learned that things would not always be as rosy as they appeared. Vehicle troubles, equipment troubles, money troubles, reality slapped me in the face, but was quickly overshadowed by the excitement of my first pregnancy. After traveling for 3 months, I learned that my dad had cancer. So with a new baby on the way, we hightailed it back home to live in my in-laws' basement while we waited for our newest member to arrive. Both of us working retail jobs to get by. My dad's cancer went into remission, and all was right with the world again. When Mandolin was a year old, we followed my in-laws to live in another city. I adore my in-laws, by the way. I know I'm weird. I was happy to be a mom, but I can see now that I was codependent in my relationship with my husband. I loved to hear him talk and dream, and my whole world revolved around him and how he perceived life. Yet I didn't pursue any independent thoughts or dreams of my own. Kind of like Julia Roberts in Runaway Bride, except I made it all the way to the altar. I was still feisty, bossy, and manipulative, but a wet noodle at the same time. As I mentioned earlier, he thought I was quite a catch, yet I didn't think I had anything else of value in our relationship besides being loyal, a hard worker, and a bauble for him to show off. As our firstborn got older, I began to resent the attention and time he would spend on her. None of it was creepy, but the kind of value that he gave to her, I did not feel like I received from him. I felt guilty for this since she is my daughter, but it wouldn't go away. I also felt resentment because we were always catching up with bills, often robbing Peter to pay Paul, putting out fires. We would sell things we owned way too often to pay off a bill, and I was often scrounging for quarters just to buy milk. There were desperate phone calls when a utility worker would show up to turn off the gas, electricity, or TV, ending with a sincere-sounding apology from him and a promise to make it better. Which he typically did, but the stress of living with the unknown always loomed. We were surviving, not thriving. He was pursuing a dream, working very hard at it, but it didn't translate to making ends meet consistently. Neither of us understood the importance of a budget, a plan, and working together toward a financial goal. I don't believe for a second that in order to thrive we must be rich, but lack of planning, lack of communication, and resentment are powerful poisons in a marriage. While I was trying to care for our little guy in the hospital, Kevin hired an agent and started booking our tours. When I was learning how to parent our baby with Down syndrome by the seat of my pants, he took us on the road. Those things weren't bad in and of themselves, but I felt alone in my concerns and I couldn't complain because what were my options? Of course, I should have voiced my concerns. Of course, I should have made a plan with him. Of course, I should have done many things, but I didn't. So I contributed to the mess we were making. I had not learned the importance of communication, so instead I bottled my frustration, which slipped out as anger, discontent, and manipulation. When little Hannah finally learned to walk at age 3, she didn't talk. When I attempted to join parents groups whose kids had Downs, I felt like I didn't belong because their kids were more high functioning than Hannah was. We went through a bout in elementary school where she went through a couple weeks of not sleeping at all. And she and I were literally going nuts from lack of it. I found out she needed medication to help that part of her brain shut down so she could sleep. And a few years later, learned she has a dual diagnosis of Down syndrome and autism. I felt like I was doing it all on my own. My husband was happy to let me handle all the details, then reprimand me for being agitated or uptight or unhappy. Which I was. I was scared. And when I'm scared, I get angry. I felt like he constantly badgered me about getting antidepressants for myself. And I constantly resented being alone, though he was right next to me. I didn't feel like I had a partner. Raising the kids and the details that went with it was my job, though he was very much a part of the laughter and the discipline. He was great at problem solving and had loads more patience with the kids than I did. Let me reiterate that these were my feelings at the time, and they may be skewed. His version is probably different than mine, yet this is what I can honestly say I felt. When he asked me to move back in after a year-long separation, I had tried to work through some of my issues and attempted to learn to forgive him for his part in our relationship mess. Yet as much as I would forgive, the problem still remained. I didn't understand boundaries. I didn't understand how to function in a healthy relationship other than the twist in the gut I felt when I watched someone else's husband treat her with respect, kindness, and understanding. I'm very aware that I didn't do my part toward him either. I knew marriage was supposed to be hard work if it was going to be worth it, but I didn't know when the worth it was going to kick in. He refused to get counseling with me, so I had no outside help other than what I could glean from books and classes. And I really didn't want to be the bad guy. Though I didn't think so at the time, having my husband leave me was one of the best things that happened because I was forced to discover myself. Forced to find out what I believe and who I want to be. Forced to stand on my own 2 feet. I was still frightened to be totally on my own, so when he wanted to move back in, I talked myself into believing that it was best for all of us. He was my husband, and I needed to fight for him. Plus, I could never make it on my own, could I? I will confess that I was afraid of myself. I knew my propensity for failure, so I constantly begged God for mercy and to not let me go. As I began to study and discover what kind of God he is, I was pleasantly surprised to find myself in an environment where I was encouraged to learn to hear his voice in my everyday life. One of the scariest things I've had to learn is to allow myself to believe that God talks to me. Why do I say scary and not hard? Well, because I feel like once you give yourself a little bit of rope in the permissions department, it can become easy to hang yourself with untruths in a hurry. That's why it's vital to have something to plumb what you think you're hearing against. My tool of choice is the Bible. I believe that God prompted and used people to write about himself, about history and his truth, and that not only is it a compilation of historical books, but a living one as well. The truths written in it must be understood not only in their original language and historical and cultural contexts, but in its entirety. The book is a whole story, and what I think I hear God speaking to me about in any given moment must be able to line up with what I know is written there. That being said, I was pretty freaked out the first time I allowed myself to walk down this path. It began with allowing myself to use my imagination, much to my pew-hugging dismay. But my heart was so ragged and torn by this time in my life that I was desperate to know if there was more out there. There had to be more. So I warily tapped into my creativity and allowed myself to consider the possibility that if I asked him to, God could and would talk to me through my thoughts, through other people, through circumstances, and through other sources, and to help bring forth memories and thoughts that could help with my healing. I have memories of much-loved childhood haunts where I can see now that my God was right beside me, even when I had no idea who he was. I now can picture Jesus smiling at me, hugging me, and calling me beloved. Imagining him enveloping me with his presence, filling me to overflowing, so that not only can I grasp that he is in me, but I also am in him. Much to my surprise, I found myself talking to God on a much more personal level, and loved it when I could hear him speak to my heart. It was difficult at first to believe that it wasn't just my overactive mind uttering whatever it was that I thought my heart wanted to hear, or vice versa. But what I came up with was that even if it was out of my own head that these things were coming from, God was still using it to speak truth to me, because I had to have gotten it from somewhere. And that's where the whole thing about plumbing against God's word is important. I could doubt till the cows came home as to whether it was truly his answering me when I called. But the fact was that if it lined up with what I considered to be the bottom line, the Bible, what was I wigging about? The fearful control freak began to loosen her death grip on possibilities and slowly began to live again. A very interesting thing happened as I dipped my big toe in to test the waters. My mom began to forward these daily emails that she received that were similar to Sarah Young's writings in Jesus Calling devotional. They were prophetic in that they were written like it was God speaking to encourage and teach me. To be honest, my heart lurched the first few days that I received them because they spoke directly to what it was I was dealing with in that particular moment. It was too easy, too weird. I was sure it was too good to be true and that I was overreacting or desperately trying to make something out of nothing. But slowly I came around. God was making a point to me. He is very real, very current, and very active, and all I needed to do was acknowledge him. Wow. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. How's that for a loaded verse? I didn't even know what to do with these words as they repeated themselves over and over in my mind like a broken record. All I knew was that I felt this inner push to make myself sit down and figure it out if I could. I had been learning a lot and felt like I was at a juncture of some kind. So, since I was out of work due to a pinched nerve that rendered me fairly helpless after we made a move to Missouri, every day I would plunk down in my overstuffed chair after seeing my family out the door, look out the window, and panic. Now what? I'd say to the heavens. Sing to me, I'd hear. So I'd sing, song after song that I had learned as a kid in Sunday school, at camp, in youth group, and in church. At first it was just out of duty, responding to the answer I had received. But slowly, as I began to relax, I could feel myself start to sing from my heart, focusing on the words, what they meant, and who I was singing them to. My brain started to relax and take a back seat, and my heart got to sit up front and navigate for once. For a few months, this was my morning ritual. And the fear and anxiety I felt as soon as I was seated took a while to abate, later to be replaced with anticipation. You see, once I made the choice to sit down and feel like an idiot, calling on God to show up and talk to me, I realized that He was faithful. As I trained my mind and my heart to switch places for an hour or so every day, I discovered that I was eager to hear from God. I could flip open my Bible once the songs dissipated and be free to consume the words with a hunger that would have otherwise been guarded with guilt and shame, because who was I to try and know something about God? He was too busy with the world. I was too small and had done too much wrong. When my focus was switched from my shortcomings, fears, and failures onto God and His pleasure, His provision, His majesty, and His might, I was free to dream, to be loved, to learn. Psalm 100 verse 4. Enter His gates with thanksgiving and His courts with praise. Give thanks to Him and praise His name. To be told to be still makes me feel like a little kid who can't help but squirm in her seat, earning the stink eye from whoever issued the command. I've learned, though, that that's not like it is with God. It's a call to let go. To release the fears and concerns we hold so tightly to in order to know that the Master of the universe is in control, that He is indeed God and is at work for us and with us. For most of my adult life, I conducted myself as a victim would. Yes, I had endured hardships, the death of my 8-month-old son, losing my dad to cancer, the unexpected special needs of my middle daughter, and a rocky marriage. What I didn't realize was that I also believed lies about myself and was unaware that I could and probably should make choices to improve the quality of my life. The very idea that the God I grew up believing in was actually smitten with me and cared a great deal about my thoughts, my feelings, and the state of my heart was very hard for me to accept. To that end, the concept of relying on Him to help me in any way, shape, or form seemed foreign and, well, wrong. Yet I knew that there had to be more, something I was missing. And dang it, I really wanted to find out whatever it was. So the overstuffed chair and I became coffee buddies every morning as I delved into a new world of learning and growing. God's timing was impeccable once again, as I had to immediately put to action what He was teaching me. My husband quit the job we'd moved to Missouri for within 6 months and proceeded on a downward spiral that was quite frightening for me. Here's what I gleaned as I happily read without interruption each morning. Not only is God bigger than me, but He desires to be incredibly personal. And there's been a whole lot of people He's been involved with way before my time that have learned the very same thing. Sarah, Moses, Noah, Jacob, Joshua, Joseph, I can't say these fast, David, Daniel, Deborah, Job, Nehemiah, just to name a few people from the Old Testament. His call to release our fears and concerns and anxieties to Him is as old as the hills. Throughout the stories in the Old Testament, He has asked His people to trust Him even when they could not see any possible way out of whatever their dilemma. And He always came through. Even if it was not in a way that they expected. It's His MO, the way He operates. He's faithful. He was and still is good to His people. For some reason, this truth was difficult for me to let soak in. teaching I had received growing up in the church somehow got twisted in my head, and I was convinced that as a Christian I was not allowed to want or hope for nice things or circumstances, ever. The verses about being content in all things meant to me that I'd better be happy with whatever I had and no griping allowed. Imagine my surprise when I couldn't help but notice that every time God's people trusted Him, followed Him, and loved Him because He loved them first, He showered them with gifts. Sometimes they really screwed up and had it all taken away for long stretches of time. But He constantly harped on the fact that He was the answer to all they wanted and needed. He wasn't holding out on them because He didn't want them to have the best. It was exactly the opposite. When they settled for less than He provided, He withdrew completely. That concept took my breath away for a while. The issue has always been about our heart and where we put our trust and affection. The takeaway for me is that whether or not I have nice things is not the point. Confidence in the one who loves me completely is. He's not a mean ogre in the sky ready to wield a big stick, keeping me from any sort of soul satisfaction, but rather an intimately personal creator who values me more than I could possibly imagine or realize. Let me just say that my time outs in my favorite chair turned out to be some of the most rewarding moments of my life. After allowing myself to open up to the possibility that there may be more to God than I had previously thought, I still found myself wrestling with my self-esteem. Trying to fix all the things I figured were wrong with me was exhausting, never mind a wild goose chase of sorts. At the core of my physical list of issues was the knowledge that it was my fault that 2 of my babies weren't normal. It just went hand in hand with the stuff I grew up believing about myself. There was something wrong with me. That's why I had to stay behind in 2nd grade math class to finish the work I couldn't understand, while all the big kids came in and gawked at me. There was something wrong with me. That's why our neighbor's mom liked my brother better and showered him with attention, because there was something wrong with me. Why my friend didn't want to play when I called her but needed a break for a few days and told me so every time I called back at the prescribed time. Why I couldn't understand high school math like the rest of my friends, even when they rallied to tutor me after class. Why I had no further aspirations than to be a wife and mother and plan parties, while everyone else was eager to go to university to better themselves. Don't get me wrong. I had plenty of wonderful things happen in my life growing up. A loving family that worked and played together, defining moments of strength and encouragement, validation of a leadership spirit, of a sense of adventure, of expectations for great things in my future. The lies were so much louder, though. They lingered with a bitter aftertaste that wouldn't fade. So in my mind, it was no wonder that 2 of my most precious desires had trouble. By the time I hit my 30s, it had become my unspoken mission to fix myself physically, and I bought every magic bean out there to make me healthy and to help me lose weight. What I didn't understand was that I thought my symptoms of depression, weight gain, subsequent anger, and general unhappiness were all physical problems, when in reality they were byproducts of a heart that had not grieved properly, that harbored resentment and bitterness toward herself and her husband, and did not realize the potency of her thought life. My perspective of myself was so screwed up that my poor body was suffering, as well as my emotional and my mental health. I worked very hard every day, yet had no hope. I survived by the skin of my teeth, and my heart was sick. Slowly but surely, as I began to read books, listen to teaching, and found a great support group to talk things through with, I found myself intrigued with the concept that God was actually quite personal and wanted a close relationship with me. As I started to grasp the foundational truth of His grace, I found a scripture verse that I had memorized as a teenager go on a continuous loop in my mind, even though I didn't fully comprehend it. Galatians 2:20. I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loves me and gave Himself for me. I interpreted the verse to mean that I had to beat myself up to die to my desires and dreams and not get any satisfaction out of life. But at the same time, another verse spoken by Jesus himself kept repeating itself in my mind. The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it to the fullest. John 10:10. As the truth of God's free gift of grace slowly seeped into my consciousness, I began to understand that it wasn't about me getting everything figured out, sorted, and fixed. It was about accepting that I was worth it to God to be made right in His eyes, His way. He's perfect. He's just. And there's nothing I can do to bring myself up to His level of perfection. Yet in His deep, deep love for His creation, His work of art, His masterpiece, He made it possible to bridge that gap. Through the life and death of Jesus, He said, okay, it's done. I love you. Let me show you my ways and let me fill you to overflowing so you can love like I do. You don't have to prove yourself to me. You don't have to try so hard. I've done all the hard work. Your job is to let me love you so you can love me in return. And as you love me, you will end up loving others like I do. See? It's done. You just have to accept it. What a backward way of doing things. It's so beautiful. Learning to come into His presence every day with a thankful, praising heart, then to sit and bask in His immense love for me, has been awkward because I thought it was kind of selfish to soak up so much love. But here's the thing. When I don't soak in that crazy love of His, I get depleted of energy and hope and strength fairly quickly. I'm a hard worker. I'm loyal. I'm committed. But I also can run on empty for too long and cause unnecessary damage. It's not selfish. It's vital. Discovering who I am to God has been mind-blowing. Just the fact that He's thrilled to hear me sing to Him warms my heart. That He wants to hear me talk to Him, to ask Him to help and provide. He's a living God who thrives in relationship within the Trinity, so it's no wonder that He designed us to also thrive in relationship with Him. Slowly, I have allowed Him access into my deepest desires, secrets, dreams, and hopes. And the amazing thing is that upon doing so, those parts of me have flourished. The emptiness, the sad ache of a dysfunctional marriage relationship was bearable to work through as I allowed Him to become my best friend, my partner, my hero, and the one who loves me inexplicably despite my hang-ups, screw-ups, flaws, and bad habits. I'm loved through and through. What a concept. It makes me want to be a better person for Him. The beauty of God's gift of grace is that in His eyes, once we accept what He's done for us through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, He then sees us as brand new. He sees the perfection, the pure righteousness of Jesus when He sees us. Not as bandaged up, broken, poorly mended, salvaged, redipped in paint, but brand new. That's what He means when He talks about being born again. I know it's a term that's been abused and lost its meaning somewhere along the way, but it is truth. When we come to God His way, we become new people. We may look, feel, and smell the same, but we're new. We're working towards it. And it's God who does it, not us. As we live in His grace, His freedom, and let His love into all the tight spaces we'd previously locked up, we begin to show this change outwardly. It's His doing. Our job is to focus on Him. Let His love overtake us, and He does the transforming. We grab our thoughts by the tail, choosing to control them, schooling them in this line of thinking, that it is His grace, not our works, that gets us into His personal space. We must transform our minds and switch from the typical way of thinking that we need to make it right with God by our actions, or using the right words, or saying the right prayers. It's all bogus to Him. Romans 8:1-4. Nothing we can do can get us into His perfection. But since He did it for us with His perfect Son, we concentrate on that, giving ourselves over to Him to make new. And He's faithful to do just that. As the years progressed, one of the more disturbing things I could not seem to get a handle on was my anger toward my husband. After being separated for an entire year, then having him ask to come back for the kids' sake, I know now that I didn't understand much about boundaries or choices, other than a sense of guilt that since we weren't officially divorced and he wanted to come back, must be a good sign. And it'd eventually work out again. I was winging it again. I knew that forgiving him for his part in our troubles was crucial for my own health and sanity. Yet as much as I practiced letting go, I had immense trouble with my emotions. All the things I had thrown in his face years before that I was unhappy about hadn't changed, though I felt immensely guilty for not only bringing them to light, but also the manner in which I did it. Finally, after wrestling with myself that it wasn't such a bad thing to admit that I couldn't figure out this part, considering it had been 7 years that we had been back together again, I relented and began to see another counselor. I detested the process of the first visit because it basically meant me recounting my life story in less than an hour, which always took up the whole time. I was shaken because over the previous 6 months I had given, I had taken a friend's advice and written out my life's happenings in the safety of a trusted group of writing pals. And when I finally got to the present day, I was flabbergasted that there wasn't a nice little bow to tie it all up with. My story was unfinished. After all that I had gone through, all that I had trusted God for, my marriage was still a joke, and I was still angry. I didn't know what to do with it all. On my second visit, my wise counselor said to me, "So, do you know what codependency is?" As I sputtered some sort of unintelligible answer, he proceeded to pull out a sheet of paper with some descriptions on it. I read as he talked and found my mouth hanging open in disbelief. I was one of them. In a nutshell, I discovered that I spent most of my energy trying to please Kevin and derived my good feelings about myself from trying to make his life as easy as possible at home, with my fear of rejection and his anger having a big say in how I behaved. I valued his opinions and way of doing things more than my own, and tended to diminish my own values or desires in order to connect with him. The quality of my life was directly proportionate to the quality of his, and I felt that his appearance was a reflection of me, which in my estimation was poor. For a large part of my marriage, I figured that my husband simply knew more than I did, so even when I didn't agree with him on something, I let him talk circles around me until I gave up. What was the point of arguing? Because I felt disregarded in the smarts department, I clung to the notion that he knew what he was talking about even if I didn't. So I arranged my life early on to please him, with learning to cook what he liked, sing what and how he liked, make phone calls the way he liked, fix his problems, avoid causing problems, get stressed when he was stressed. To be fair, I realized that I learned some of this behavior growing up from a parent who also learned it growing up. It was a yucky family heirloom of sorts. To make matters worse, though, my partner did have issues that should have been dealt with that I was trying to make up for on my own, unaware of my own shortcomings and how they added to it all. What was my reaction when I fully realized the kind of life I'd lived as an adult? I wanted to get the hell out of Dodge. With a gentle chuckle and an understanding smile, my counselor once again spoke wisdom when he said it was important that I sit on my hands for about a year as I processed all this new information. He directed me to a local Al-Anon group for support and encouraged me to learn to deal with myself and my habits, tendencies, and quirks before I cut all ties. Valuable, life-giving advice, as much as I hated to hear it. After another year of coexisting under the same roof with my husband, I took my daughters with me back home to Canada to visit family and friends for a few weeks during their summer vacation. He'd been attempting to transition in his work from being bankrolled by some very good people in his recording company to being self-sufficient. And it was to have been completed about the time we returned from our trip to Canada. Instead, I discovered that 2 months of rent was due when I returned, as well as all of our utilities. I understood that things don't always go like we planned, but our situation was shrouded in distrust, and I had had enough. Life in Missouri had been full of just as much uncertainty as it had back home in Canada, and as much as I had hoped that things would be different in a new environment, the problems and distrust followed us. So when I pushed him about where we were at, and his response was to threaten me with divorce, I simply asked if he checked into it and how much it would cost. We separated again, though he ended up living with us on and off for the next year as he attempted to look for work and figure out what to do with himself. Finally, we had the divorce papers written up and filed. By this time, I had traveled the gamut of emotions regarding divorce. I was a Christian, so how dare I? What would people think? Was I giving up? Did we try hard enough? All I can say now is that I have peace about it. I cannot please the rest of the Christian world, but I can do my best to please my God by seeking His face, His answers, His direction, and waiting for His release. For 10 years, I have worked at reconciling, worked at changing myself, tried counseling together at long last. But when change is largely one-sided, it's difficult to get anywhere as a couple, particularly with red flags like infidelity and money constantly at the forefront. He was relatively happy with the way things were. He was taken care of, had a relative amount of freedom, and got to come home every day to a house full of his girls, food and comfort. After 20 years of being together, I still felt alone, and that I was doing most of the work, trying to navigate clues that pointed to issues that were very, very unhealthy. So far, our communication has been fairly decent and things are surprisingly amicable. And my daughters often comment about how much I laugh these days. I guess it's something they haven't heard from me in a long time over the years. I don't believe that divorce is the answer for everybody, right across the board. Obviously. But it's taken me a long, long time to even consider it, let alone go through with it. And I'm convinced that God has not abandoned me because of it, and that I am still loved. Not because I found an escape clause somewhere, but because of His grace. Because of what Jesus has done for me. Because He is God, and I am not. I'd be lying if I tried to tell you that my story has that nice little bow wrapped around it now. That all the loose ends have been tied up, that my dark days are but a distant memory, that I no longer feel the heavy weight of loss, of grief, of failure, of disappointment. The truth would be that although I cannot attest to sunshine and daisies every day, I do have hope. My hope springs from faith in a God who I can't see, but who shows up anyway. Who tirelessly works to let me know how much He loves me, and when I let Him, fills my deepest longings. Sure, I wish my circumstances were different in many aspects, but I know I'm not alone, and that I have meaning and purpose. I'm a work in progress, and it's okay. I no longer allow the lie that there's something wrong with me to take root, but instead, I'm aware that my Creator fashioned me with great detail and care, and has designed me to bring Him glory in a way that only I can do, because I'm made in His image in a unique way only He knows, just like you. So on those days when I'm low and feel despair, when I wonder if I'll ever get over this particular hump or ever be able to realize my dreams, I remember that God is for me. He delights in me. He puts His dreams within me, and He has not left me to my own devices. Learning to personalize God's love for me has made all the difference. The toughest lessons I've learned have been to trust Him even though I can't see or hear Him. I'm not a naturally patient person. And having lived in fear for so long, it's taken God's own hand to persuade me that He's worthy of my trust and dependence. Learning to not strive so hard, to always fix things, has been an ongoing struggle. But faith is an active form of worship, something that must be cultivated. Hope springs from that faith, hope in a future. There have been times when it's been so hard to keep going that I truly wished God would just take me home to be with Him. I didn't contemplate suicide. I just wanted to be done with the pain of this world and was so convinced of God's goodness and His promise for no more tears there that I longed for it. I still do sometimes. It doesn't mean I don't work hard at what I do. It's just that my priorities are different, and my hope is in my God who loves me, as opposed to what I think I have to accomplish in order to survive. But I'm also convinced of this. I'm a much different person after having gone through the tough things that I have had in my life. I'm aware that my trials do not compare to the horrors and devastation that others have gone through, but this isn't a contest. It's not about what we've done, what's been done to us, what we go through, or what we have or don't have. It's about who we are, who we've become after it all. And I know that I'm not the same as I once was. As a woman, I used to believe that there was something inferior about me in comparison to a man, and I hated it. I despised the woman described in Proverbs 31 because I figured she was either a figment of someone's imagination or someone trying too hard, trying to show off the rest of us poor saps who could not get anywhere close to her accomplishments. I also cringed at the idea that a church-going woman was expected to be behind the scenes, plan potlucks, teach other people's children, and most of all, be quiet. Yuck. That doesn't jive with my personality at all. I had been living with a misconception that I was not as valuable as a man, and that lie was not only nurtured within the church, but in society as well. And then I learned something profound that has set me on an entirely different course. When God created woman, he called her Iser Conecto. I think I say that right. Or what we read as helper or helpmate. I used to think that it was kind of a demeaning title until I read that the word God called us is the very same word used in other parts of the Bible referring to himself when he was called upon to rescue or enable someone. The hero. God created woman in his image, just like he created man, just differently. Strength, ability, honor, tenaciousness, beauty, gentleness. I'm still waiting on that one. Creativity, adventurous, nurturing, capable, confident. Oh man, the list goes on. We are valuable in all our femininity and desperately needed. We're the crown and glory of God's creation. Discovering that my physical appearance was not a sick joke, but a reflection of his creativity has allowed me to not panic so much about what I look like, but instead focus on caring for this body he outfitted me with because he values me. What a difference. I'm free to allow myself to be a whole beautiful being inside and out. He created me to be powerful in a good way, strong, driven by love and not fear, to be poured out to others as he pours into me. The twist here is that I don't need to reverse gender roles in order to be successful. It's not about me wearing the pants in the family in order to prove I'm just as good as a man or better. No, I can build a life I want, and I'm valuable. What beauty in that concept. What freedom. How ingenious our God is. The thrilling thing for me in accepting these truths is that I know I'm never alone. I recognize that in this new kingdom he's brought to us, that I am like royalty, his heir, and I'm never alone or without resources. He not only steps into me to fill me completely with his love and grace, but he envelops me so that not only am I in him, but he is in me. We have a relationship, and he dances with me, making me feel like I'm incredibly valued and loved, even when I stumble or step on his toes. He sings to me. He laughs with me and at me. He's patient when I struggle. He corrects me when I'm wrong. He encourages me when I'm low, and he leads me to the best possible places for supply and rest. Sure, I'm aware that life will continue to have trouble. He said so himself. But I'm confident in his connection to me that he will never let me go because he prizes me. Even if I die an awful death, I will never be without him.